18 months on remand, five of the Filton 24 walked free, and not one activist was convicted of a single offense. The verdict has blown a hole through the UK state's attempt to criminalize Palestine solidarity. Joining us is Saeed Taji Faruqi to unpack what this moment really means in activism, especially Palestinian solidarity and activism, in light of a number of events of the last, well, you could say 18 to 24 months, including the banning of a number of Palestinian associated and related organizations. What does this current state of, the ruling of the courts mean in showing that much of what was done by the state was in fact improper and downright illegal? Assalamu alaikum, Brother Saeed.
Alaikum assalam. Thanks for having me on.
Brother Saeed, from your vantage point as a filmmaker and observer of power, I mean, was this verdict about the law or about a jury quietly pushing back against a political prosecution? That's what it might have been, a political prosecution.
Well, I think it was a political prosecution, but we also have to see the jury's decision within the bounds of the law, right? I mean, the jury is very carefully directed by the judge and the prosecution to make a decision based on the law. They asked a lot of questions very specifically about the application of the law. The judge was very strict about how they should apply the law. They were, however, reminded by one of the defense attorneys, one of the defense barristers, that like any jury in this country, they're allowed to acquit based on their conscience, as well as, of course, taking into account everything that's happened in the trial. We'll never know, to be honest, whether they acquitted based on their conscience or whether they acquitted based on the evidence in front of them. But the fact is that the evidence they were presented with supports their decision to acquit on 9 of the charges. There are still several that they couldn't come to a decision on. And what that now means is that's a matter of law, that it is a matter of fact now that they were not guilty of aggravated burglary, for example, which was the most serious.
Let's look at, of course, the case, right? 5 activists are out, but Samuel Corner remains inside. How does selective bail shape the narrative of justice, and what message does it send to activists watching this closely? I mean, if you could put us into some sort of context as to who these activists were, and especially the role of someone like Samuel.
Yeah, well, I should say the 5 are out on bail. So they're still, all of them have at least one undecided verdict. The state may choose to retry those. It may also choose to drop them. That depends on the state's decision. They're supposed to make the decision based on whether it's in the public interest. I would say they're more likely to make the decision based on the political interest. But nevertheless, those 5 are out on bail with fairly strict bail conditions. I have to be careful about how I talk about these people, okay? Because obviously they took action with Palestine Action that's now banned. I can't say anything that sounds like it supports Palestine Action because that would be a terrorist offense in this country. I also have to be careful what I say about Samuel Corner because he still has a serious charge against him that could be retried. So there are things that I can't discuss because there's still reporting restrictions on his case. Nevertheless, I'll try and answer your question. The people on trial, and they're all fairly young, early to mid-20s, are very ordinary people from a broad range of backgrounds and races and religions, united by their disgust at Britain's role in the genocide of the Palestinian people. And they're all people who described very eloquently on the stand their journey from ordinary citizens or residents of Britain to activists in one way, many of them going on marches, signing petitions, writing to their MPs, and finally seeing, because of specifically Britain's role in the genocide of the Palestinian people, that the only available option was direct action against weapons companies. The only option that could truly save lives, because they understood that the state was not on their side and they had to take action themselves. They made incredibly emotional, impactful testimonies describing that emotional journey, and for some, that religious journey, the duty that they felt. And clearly, that convinced the jury that these people were not violent criminals. Now, you asked about bail also. I mean, what we've seen in this
Mm.
case, and I think it's very clear, because these defendants have been in prison now for a year and a half. They have all been found not guilty of the most violent offense. They may never be tried for the other offenses. So the possibility exists that they will have spent a year and a half never having been fully convicted of a single crime. That is what's called using the process as the punishment. And I believe,
Mm.
because many other defendants who had similar charges have been on bail in the past, I believe the state was using bail as a preemptive punishment and as a way to frighten other activists.
Brother Said, there's a number of interesting statements during the course of the trial itself. And one was where the prosecution framed sledgehammers as weapons and the defense framed them as tools to stop weapons. And I think many people picked up on this here. Is there any way that we could eventually identify how did the jury actually view the usage of sledgehammers in this particular case, as weapons or as tools to stop weapons? Many may say it'll term as something interesting for future trials, which are likely to happen in the current climate that we see out there in the UK currently, as to how a jury sees an item in a context of a protest and activism.
Yeah, I mean, I will say anyone who's been to a trial, especially a jury trial, will know that they spend an awful lot of time debating the meaning of individual words, right? So, I mean, to the point where it seems like the trial has nothing to do with the issue at hand, but just semantics. So that's one of the characteristics of trials in this country, anyway, unfortunately. But I will say that for several years now, probably the benchmark would have been the Colston trial, when people were tried for tearing down the statues of slave trader Colston in Bristol. That trial set a fairly scary precedent, which is that attacking or the destruction of a statue could be considered violence, right? That was not a precedent set prior. So, for example, I found in my trial, when the only thing I had been accused of was spraying red paint on a building, the red paint was contained in a pressurized fire extinguisher. And the prosecution tried, and luckily failed, but tried to characterize the fire extinguisher as a weapon. The judge, of course, dismissed the idea. It was ridiculous. But they did manage to characterize our protest, which again involved sitting in front of a door and the building spray painted with red, as violent. So it's very clear, and I would say it's specifically about Palestinian protest, but it's very clear that the state is desperately trying to characterize any form of dissent and any form of protest for the liberation of the Palestinian people as violent, and then in the extreme now, as terrorism.
Brother Said, finally, of course, there's still much more to be said about, the Filton 24, and we'll be certainly following up this case in the events that follow in the days or weeks ahead. But when it comes to activism out in the UK, these clampdowns, be it this trial or be it other types of forms of rhetoric coming out of the state, it may be early to say conclusively, but has this emboldened a new phase of resistance legally, culturally out in the UK, that what, you can't keep us silent. This is a movement that is gaining momentum. Finally, the blinkers have been pulled off many eyes, and no matter how many trials or no matter how many laws the UK state wishes to inculcate or even submit as part of their armor, you can't stop resistance at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I will say that after the prescription of Palestine Action, things were very quiet for a long time. People were really unsure what the scope of the law was. Obviously, it had scared most activists, even those who had nothing to do with Palestine Action. The state said the banning of Palestine Action would not impact pro Palestinian protests in general. Of course, that was a lie. There was a very slow period. I think what's happened since then, the duplicity of the state is undeniable. The state's participation and support of Israel's genocide is undeniable. And what people saw is that the state will now stop at nothing to crush both our rights to protest in this country and any support for Palestinian liberation in this country. And the people have had enough. And what we've seen in the last 1 or 2 months is an incredible, I would call an uprising. People are no longer afraid of arrest, which is an incredible change. People are no longer afraid even of being charged with terrorism offenses. Every week there is a new autonomous group that is doing direct action against Israeli weapons manufacturers. Every day there is a demonstration in front of the prisons showing solidarity with the other Filton 24. Every day there are demonstrations in the streets telling the state that business as usual is no longer an option. So I've seen an incredible, not only amount of people, number of people willing to take part, but also a very severe mind shift, that they no longer have that sense of fear, and they no longer believe in the myth of the benevolent state that is here to, as they keep saying, protect our rights to protest or even protect our democracy. They're eroding our democracy, and people won't stand for it anymore. People won't take it anymore.
Brother Saeed Taji Faruqi, shukran. Thank you for joining us on Radio Islam International with this discussion and, of course, updating us on matters coming out of the Filton 24 case, which is still certainly ongoing. Assalamu alaikum and greetings to you, Brother Saeed.
Ma salama. Thank you so much.
Brother Saeed.